Yeah, it's great to have you back for the purposes of chairing this meeting, and there are a couple of things I think which will possibly be of interest to you, and not the least of which is something which I think is probably going to be a bit of an annoyance, because this presentation, this seminar, is basically me trying to shift position. And I think this is one of the things that, in a very kind of, endeared kind of a way, drives David's distraction about me, is that I'm always in the position, I'm always trying to shift position. I'm trying to accommodate different views. I don't stick with a line. I'm sort of guilty of for me, very pleasurable and always very challenging hither and thither. But hence the fact that I'm at least 25 years into an academic career, and I don't feel as if I particularly got a specialism. And I think the specialism, if I've got anything, is changing my mind, which I guess makes theatre probably the only amenable vehicle for whatever skills I have as a scholar. Anyway, this is a presentation about a project which began back in about 2018 as a series of discussions between three of us at the time, between me and David Sills-Jones and Hugh Pennant-Jones. And the plan at that point, when I came on board, the plan was to see if we could together be a kind of creative team responsible for making a feature film. This was great for me because I hadn't been involved with anything like that before, and it must have marked a stage of true desperation on their part to ask somebody with absolutely no experience to be involved as a director on this. But I thought, right, this is great. So shortly after the first conversation, I went and read the novel. And shortly after I'd read the novel, David Sills-Jones emigrated to New Zealand. And so that created a rather different sort of set of parameters for this project. It made the question of making a feature film very different. It created a very different context for it. So that was the first thing that happened. Then we decided that we would meet up and we would do a sort of session of work at a conference of the Screenwriters Research Network, SRN, in Porto in September 2019. You know, Portugal in September, why wouldn't you? So that was when we met up, and that was a kind of, it was just me and David at that point. And we talked about what could be done, what we had done, and what the way forward might be. Then we went our separate ways, promising to, meet up again and to try and make progress with this project. And then 2019 stopped and 2020 started happening. And everything I think that we had proposed up to that point looked very, very different from the optic of 2020. So we haven't been in touch really about this project for a good long time until I contacted David in New Zealand on Teams the other day, and we had a conversation, and I recorded a series of interviews with him about our original approach to the project and some of the aspects, some of the attitudes that might sort of arise as a result of what's happened in the meantime. But I think it's a significant thing in itself. I mean, this is why I've dared to put this up for a research seminar, is that I think the shattering of a kind of unified plan and the overtaking of certain aspects of that plan by contemporary events contemporary in a new changed reality, which means, of course, that we're doing all of this over Teams and we are not in, you know, direct contact with each other in a room. That breakage, I think, is itself is significant, and it's something which I want to think more about, and it's something that I want to try and incorporate into the way that I talk about this project at all. So this is a sort of first step in doing that. I will present what I can present about this and give you as much context, hopefully in as clear a way as possible, about the project and what we managed to do. And then at the earliest possible opportunity, I think I will stop and I will play some section of the interview with Dafydd, and then I will try and answer questions. So that's what I plan to do. So I'll try and keep an eye on the clock as I do this. But I'll just go through some of the stuff, some of the background stuff, and some of the attitudes, some of the aspects we have discussed already as a group. All right. So this is the process of returning to this novella by Gerallt, Cafflogion. First of all, Cafflogion is, it's not just the name of a novel. It was not originally the name of a novel. It's the name of a place. And it goes back an awful long way. So this is back in the 5th century. The land's administered by a post-Roman ruler called Cineva. And Cafflogion at that point, according to this map at least, refers to this area here at the tip of the Ffilm Peninsula. All right. If we look at 15th century, this isn't a 15th century map of Wales, but it's derived from information about the 15th century. Again, you can see that Cafflogion is here defined as a commode, which is, I think, well, it's up to about a third of 100, a cantref. So the cantref, the 100 in this case, would have been llyn, and you can see that it's made up of a number of different areas. I think one of the things that's interesting here, and I'm delighted that Mike Pearson is at this, is in the audience for this, because it plays, I think, to this interest which Mike had a number of years ago about choreography, and the way that we negotiate and create and acknowledge boundaries around our areas of dwelling. So these are boundaries which are not sort of marked on the earth, and they're not necessarily anymore marked formally by signposting or anything. They are just there as matters of lived experience. People understand that they move from one kind of sub area to another. So no doubt there would have been some kind of administrative significance to the boundaries around Cafflogion here in the 15th century, but they are no longer observed. Cafflogion is occasionally still used for groups of cultural groups, so choirs, theatre companies, people like that, who come together in that area. So, there is still some kind of residual sense of bro Cafflogion about that area in northwest Wales. So we have to move on then and think about the way that Cafflogion was taken up by Gerallt-Jones. So we do need to say a little bit about Gerallt-Jones here, because I think there are certain things about his biography and about his work that are significant to us. So he was born in 1934. He rejoiced under the rather wonderful name of Robert Geralt Hamlet Jones. He was a very well-known poet and prose writer, a critic and academic. He was a very good cricketer as well. Born in that area around Cafflogion in the Ffilm Peninsula, born at Nefyn, which is a little bit further north than that 15th century map would have shown. One of the important things about his life, though, which is worth noting here, and one might think has a kind of relationship to the novel, was that he was educated at Shrewsbury, and as it says here, as Denstone College in Staffordshire. So he was sent away to a boarding school in Shrewsbury at the age of 10, when he was largely monoglot. He didn't speak any English at that point in his life, having been brought up in a completely sort of Welsh-speaking area. But he was brought up by a family, I guess, who was dominated by his father, who was an Anglican vicar, who had a visceral dislike of Welsh nonconformist chapel culture for various reasons. So he sent his son away to be educated in Shrewsbury, and it was a pretty drastic step at the time. And I think it may have been a sort of, a cultural crisis which drove the poor man, Geralt Jones, to being a writer in order to be able to cope with this incredible experience of being uprooted and exiled. So he was sent to Shrewsbury to school, and then to a minor public school up in Staffordshire. And it wasn't until he undertook his BA degree that he came back to Wales to study. So he then went to study English at the University College of North Wales in Bangor. And also in Bangor, he completed an MA thesis on the work of Robert Graves. So I think that experience of education is rather formative, and it's something that we should bear in mind when it comes to thinking about the nature of Cafflogion as a text, and also thinking about some of the characters in Cafflogion. Thereafter, his working life took him to several different places. He worked as a writer throughout his life, but he was also involved in education. Firstly, as a warden in Mandeville College in Jamaica, which was very important to him as an experience, and really, along with his education in a foreign land, gave him a kind of perspective on his own area of upbringing, his own sort of Villtir Sgwâr, which was quite at odds in some way with some of the prevailing tropes about belonging to places that were common within Welsh literature at the time. And certainly that period in Jamaica reflected itself in some of his written work, because he did do 2 volumes of sort of autobiography, as it were, about his time in Jamaica, and also an interest in the condition of life in the developing world, alongside his interest in Welsh literature. So he worked at Mandeville College in Jamaica. He was a teacher at Thomas Jones School in Amlwch. He was at the Department of Education back in the days when we were the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth. That was in the late 50s, early 60s. Then he became the warden of Llandyfri College, and then returned to Aberystwyth as the head of extramural studies. And then finally, while he was he still had a link with Aberystwyth University, he was the warden of Gregonog Hall when it was still a kind of University of Wales conference centre. And I do remember he had quite a close relationship with the Department of Theatre, Film and Television Studies back in the mid-1990s. So I think he was one of the people who was instrumental in the very early days of the degree in Film and Television Studies that we were developing at that time in the mid-90s. We could do a whole list of his written work. But he was quite prolific, so I won't go a whole way through it by any means. One of the important things is that he twice won the National Eisteddfod Prose Medal, a Fedal Ryddiaith, which is one of the sort of premier competitions in the Eisteddfod. He won it in 1977 with his novel Triptych, and then importantly, from our point of view, he won it in 1979 for his novel Cafflogion, which I will come to in a minute. You'll hear more about this in a minute. But on being educated in my misprint, unfortunately, England, he said this, and I think this is important as a kind of little touchstone for us. Wales, for me, he said, was a hearth, a home, a wonderful world, hidden, separate from the world of school, a proud possession of my own, a secret room that my English friends knew nothing about. And I think that experience, I feel, though I stand warned about these sort of direct translations from someone's biography into their creative work, but I think it's hard not to see some kind of shadow of that experience and some kind of framework from that experience in Cafflogion. So to talk about Cafflogion and the novel, here it is. It's, look at it, well, end on, you can see it's not very thick. It's a sort of novella, as I think is only appropriate for the literary prose medal competition in the National Eisteddfod. They don't award them for kind of full-length, full-scale novels. They are that medal is awarded for work, 60,000 words. So it's a short novel. It's a fairly sort of compact piece. It could really be a lot longer, I'm sure. But we'll leave it as it is for now. We'll discuss what it presents to us. It is a kind of, I guess it's a dystopian science fiction novel set in, it's an indistinct date, but I think it is kind of middle to late 21st century. And what it proposes is that at that time, Britain is divided up into 5 regions, which he doesn't sort of specify where the regions are, but I imagine it kind of, in his imagination, it might equate to regions which look a little bit like that. So Britain is divided up into 5 regions. And it is one part of a broader neoliberal and very nastily authoritarian United States of Europe, which is one of the real surprises when you read this work from 1979 in view of more recent political events. So the United States of Europe is seen as, generally a pretty bad, anti-communitarian kind of structure. And one of those regions contains Wales, I guess, even though Wales as such is not named at any point in the novel. It's just merely a repository for a place called the City. So for this region, we have the City. At one point, it discusses one of the characters returning to the sort of administrative hub, and that's called CF6. I don't think that postcode still exists, but it sort of broadly equates to Cardiff and Barry and the Vale. So it's kind of that sort of place. Well, it is more just Barry and the Vale, actually. The CF6 is not present actually in the city of Cardiff. But certainly what we've got is this idea that there's this big urban sprawl down in the south of Wales. And that urban sprawl has drawn through a series of very harsh laws of limitation. It has drawn the population into it. And the countryside beyond the realms of the city has become largely uninhabited. And anyone who basically tried to carry on living outside the city has found themselves in a great deal of privation. Groups of people have tried over the years starting at about, I think, 1991, he suggests, when the laws of limitation first come in. They tried to leave the city and go and live in the country and get away from the repressive atmosphere of the city, but they haven't been able to, and, you know, they've never been heard of again. Several groups of people have just, you know, starved to death. Towns throughout Wales have therefore just sort of fallen into ruin. And early on in the novel, we have a story of a helicopter ride whereby a filmmaker from the city called Geralt flies out of the main urban centre and flies over the town of Brecon, or the city of Brecon, actually, because it's got a cathedral, and, you know, looks down on it and basically sees most of the city just kind of abandoned and crumbling, except for the kind of the large cathedral in the middle. So Cafflogion is a settlement on the far forgotten outskirts, and although he doesn't say where it is directly, it does equate to this area in northwest Wales, because they have their settlement somewhere in the midst of this land, and then also further up the coast they've got a port which they use, which is at Porthdenllain, which is just near Morfanefin. So Cafflogion is on the far outskirts. They trade, they support themselves independently. They are a kind of self-sufficient community. But they also sustain themselves, or have sustenance, with by having trade links, not with the city, but with Ireland. And Ireland, since the late 1980s, has been united, and it's also opted out. It did not opt in at any point to the United States of Europe. So Ireland is a sort of freedom-loving country across the sea from Cafflogion. So how it's managed to keep itself independent from the rest of Europe, we don't know. It's not mentioned, but that's one of the conditions, and it allows them to make more of a living for themselves by trading with Ireland. And also then there's another sort of independent settlement up in Caergybi. Now it's slightly different from Holyhead, I imagine, because he makes a point of saying it as two words. One in Welsh, Caergybi is one word. So I imagine this is not necessarily fully equivalent to the town of Holyhead, the port of Holyhead, but rather it is, you know, I think it just reminds us of that place because of the use of the name. So here's David's synopsis of the novella. And I know that I have to kind of tell this story as well as I can, so I'll stick to what he's got here. So when the city forbids people to live in the country, as I've already said, a small band of visionaries set up an off-grid community called Cafflogion, or in Cafflogion, which is led by a guy called Ieuan. Ieuan was one of 12 who set themselves apart from the city and try and find a place where they can create an independent community, because they are disgusted by the atomization of existence within the city, and also the fact that the city has a sort of relentlessly and damagingly competitive ethic, and they want to live in a more communitarian kind of a way. So 12 men come together, and they are people with very particular skills, both academic and practical. And so some of them come with their families, some of them come with their children, some of them come just with their marriage partners. And Ieuan actually abandons his family in order to join that band of 12. And he's the only one who's left alive of that band of 12 at the time when the novel takes place. So they've been there since about 1991, when they left the city. And for the first 10 years, those 12 people decided that what they wanted to do was to try and organize some kind of a community. And they would not allow anybody else in, and there was an embargo on having any more children. Okay, so nobody who had a family up there with them was to have any children within that period of trying to establish and trying to set up the community. So it is quite strict in its own way about, you know, how you are to live your life. So it's not a sort of, you know, an idyll of freedom. The question of living a communitarian existence exacts very particular requirements of the people who live there. So those were the first generation. Their children, and also people who arrived and were invited in after that first 10-year period, are the second generation. And the novel takes place at the point, just after the point where the first member of the third generation of Cafflogion, who is Sean, the son of Alun and Mair, is born. So at the time of that child's birth, it is decided from within the community that it is now time to show the morally vapid city, as Dafydd puts it, how life ought to be lived. So what they do is that they do something which is rather drastic and, as it turns out, disastrous. And they make themselves known to certain elements within the city. They seek to make contact with the city. And what happens is that Alun is sent as an emissary to contact a famous city filmmaker called Geralt. And they invite him up from the city to Cafflogion in order that he might make a film about their life there. So this is, yes, it comes from a kind of moral imperative to do this. But at the same time, it's there as, you could think of it as slightly hubristic, or you could think of it as something which has got a kind of rather troubling death wish attached to it. And Ieuan is a figure whose actual motives for allowing and seeking to further this contact with a city is never really fully examined. So anyway, Geralt flies up to Cafflogion in a helicopter. The filmmaker arrives. The ensuing film, after it is made, scares the city's secret services. Geralt, while he's there, is quite, surprised and impressed by what he sees. He sees that these people's way of life is very different from his own. They are given far more regularly to quite sort of strenuous physical activity, so they look physically different. They spend far more of their time out of doors, so they're sort of darker and ruddy in terms of their complexion, and they wear very different clothes. So their lives are basically, as far as Geralt is concerned, sort of devoted to the practicalities of keeping themselves alive as a community. And I think that's one of the things that he feels is very, very different between the life in the city and the life in Cafflogion as a community. As with, all descriptions of kind of utopian universes, this place, Cafflogion, has got within it a very strong sense of purpose and order, it would seem, and that idea of purpose and order has completely suffused the lives of the people who live there. So anyway, he goes back, very impressed with this, to the city and makes his film, thinking, of course, that it is just going to be greeted as a sort of curio and this exotic sort of entity far away from the city, which the city had basically forgotten about and wasn't bothered with. It would just appeal to a very select elite audience and that nobody would really be particularly worried about it. But what happens, of course, is that the secret services look at this and immediately see the danger in what the life of the people of Cafflogion poses to residents of the city. This alternative view of life is something that they're desperately worried about, and they seek to suppress it. So what they do is that they tell Geralt, you have to go back to Cafflogion, and you have to go back with an emissary from the secret services, a guy who is only known as, well, no, he's known as the Redhead, usually, a Pengoch, but he tells Geralt to call him Terry. that is, of course, not his real name. But anyway, they go together back to Cafflogion, and Garth has to sort of tell the people of Cafflogion, sorry, there's another couple of days filming we needed to do. And he's not allowed to tell them why he is back and what he's got, why he's brought this guy with him. They arrive and they do the filming, and then after he goes back with the redhead, and after the redhead has a number of interviews with the leaders of Cafflogion as a settlement, the decision is made at the Ministry of Control that this is too dangerous a place for them to allow to survive. And they decide, or the tendency is that they're going to decide to try and get rid of this settlement. In the meantime, Cafflogion's leader, Ieuan, and his lieutenants, as David has described me here, Stefan and Mike, they consider armed rebellion because they are very suspicious about what's now actually going on. And following a really rather disastrous conversation between Ieuan and the redhead, they think our days are numbered. So they consider armed rebellion, and this conversation is overheard by the secret services in the city, because when they went back, the redhead dropped bugs everywhere. Ieuan secretly warns only Alin about what he thinks is about to happen, Alin and Mair, and he tells them to leave. Well, he doesn't really tell them to rebuild Cafflogion elsewhere, but that's the implication of what he says. So because he doesn't give them a pass to go to the port and to leave for Ireland or some other pre-existing place. He sends them along this sort of shattered road into the middle of nowhere and says, "Start again." So Alin and Mair, this is the end of the story, is that Alin and Mair escape into the desolate Welsh hills just in time as Cafflogion is then destroyed in a series of air raids, along with all its inhabitants. So that's the basic the story of the novel. That's what we were dealing with. I think I've dealt with most of those things in the course of my synopsis. I should really kind of get on. A couple of things here, though, are significant, and it's some of the things that make the novel rather a curio, really, I suppose. As a character, Alin, this guy who is given the capacity to escape at the end, he isn't a sort of ideal candidate for this job. Throughout the novel, which is basically divided up, this is probably going to be far too small for you to see, but it's divided up into a series of, this way, yeah. It's divided up into a series of sort of, chapter sections, which are narrated by different figures, different characters. So there isn't a sort of one consistent one narrator voice going through all of it. And what happens is that Alin is kind of presented as slightly hysterical, very intuitive, and certainly not given to articulacy. So his passages always reflect on the fact that he isn't really very capable of telling. He has a distinct sense that his sorry, the microphone was muting and throwing me, but he has a distinct sense of dread and that things are going to go very, very, very badly. Then towards the end of the novel, there's two things that happen. First of all, Ieuan, in conversation with Alin, says he kind of knew for a long time that this was going to be inevitable and that Cafflogion was going to be destroyed. So its destruction was going to be inevitable. He knows this, and he didn't really do anything about it. So it really throws Ieuan's character into a kind of relief, and you think, well, what is this guy? Is he some kind of great visionary seer, this sort of benign pacifist who just thinks, que sera, sera. If they do come and get us, then so be it. Or is he some kind of death cult eco-fascist? It's very hard to tell. And to return to my original point about Geralt Jones and his father, it's very interesting that Ieuan is the father figure in this community, and he's extremely kind of ambiguous as a character in terms of his morality then. And the final thing about it is that it's a significant little detail, but just as Garth leaves the community for the last time, following the disastrous argument between Redhead and Ieuan, as he leaves, feeling deeply implicated in the impending destruction of this place, he looks back at the house where the argument took place, where Ieuan lives, and he sees on the table, or he sees that Ieuan is back reading a book by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was, I think even at the time, he's a highly controversial figure, a Jesuit priest, paleontologist, who was very committed to the idea of some kind of interface between his own Christian view of the world and of matters of the spirit, plus the the geological origins of the earth. And so he created this idea of the noosphere, wherein he believed basically that ideas in the world, people's ideas, human ideas, were sort of capable of forming themselves into another sort of biosphere, an alternative biosphere, within the very fabric of material life on Earth. So he is now kind of regarded as sort of an appalling pseudoscientist. But he did sort of work very thoroughly within the world of paleontology, and he was partly responsible for the discovery of Peking man in China, where he spent many, many years. But this is thrown in to the novel towards the very, very end, and it's something which makes it read, I think, very differently now from what it did back in 1979, because of the fact now that you've got such concerns about pseudoscience and denial of, science, fake news, alternative truth, and all this kind of stuff. So from being something of a kind of utopian stroke dystopian novel, which was, awarded the medal, which made it, representative of possibly the most respectable right in relation to the Welsh letters at the time. It now looks, it's got these sort of very, very weird angles. First of all, the fascistic United States of Europe, and secondly, an implicit celebration of the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So that has taken me ages. What we did, and I'm not going to go through this in very much detail now because I don't think I've got the time. But what we did first of all was that Dafydd proposed a different kind of synopsis and treatment for the work. And that reflected the fact that we were not thinking of this as the novel for an Eisteddfodic competition anymore. We were thinking about it as a feature film, and as such it had to be changed so that it met the kind of needs of popular, wide audience work, although, as David said, it was just slightly at the arty end of that, we hoped. So he made a new version of it, a new treatment of it, an adaptation of it, to meet the needs of the Ffilm Cymru Development Fund. And what happened there was that it was translated, as it were, from being some kind of neoliberal dystopia, which was being relieved by a promise of a better communitarian future. What happened was that he decided that Cafflogion would be a sort of very, very furthest outpost of the city at a time of ecological crisis, which, you know, he really hyped up and souped up a bit. First of all, to say that communication between the city and the outskirts was made difficult because of some kind of natural interference from quickly growing forests, which stopped telecommunication signals from being sent and received. So Cafflogion was just a sort of outlying community, but it was a sort of very big farm, which is there in the original novel. And what happened was that they were serviced once a week by a train which came up from the city, which then they sort of loaded up with crops and artifacts, and which left a certain amount of stuff for them. But largely their lives revolved around the business of supplying the train. Secondly, and this is one of the things which really went up in the air in 2020, was that for the purposes of the feature film, we decided that the early sections of it would be dedicated to shots of people kind of laboriously suiting up in protective gear, because of the fact that the farm itself, the crops, while they were still living and growing out of the earth, were producing some kind of toxic byproduct, some kind of natural spores, which made them deeply dangerous for people to be around. So what we had was this rather nice dystopian view, this dystopian vision of people growing crops, being outside farming, but in real big, thick biohazard suits. This was before, of course, the advent of PPE, something which we are all now rather concerned with. So what happens there is what the film treatment suggested was that after the weekly train arrives from the city to take food back to the starving urban multitude, along with it came Garth, the filmmaker. So he came along really without any kind of warning. He just came up to try to be someone who was documenting the city. So he was a kind of intruder into the peace of the community. But also what we wanted to do by that was to sort of reflect on what happens when a story is told, and how does telling a story affect the status of the thing that you're telling the story about. And you cannot just come in, tell a story, expose the narrative of these people's lives and expect their lives to remain the same. And Garth, as a filmmaker, I think is well aware of that. So storytellers are not sort of just innocent observers. They are implicit, and they are implicated, in the nature of the object that they are trying to narrate. And what is one of the nice things in the original novel is the fact that Garth gets this sort of moment of conversion to thinking how great it is, how great the life of the people in Cafflogion is. But then when he goes back to the city, he kind of forgets about it. He's deeply troubled at the fact that his work has got Cafflogion into trouble. But the end of his sort of sections in the original novel suggests that he's just thought, oh, well, there you go. That didn't work out so well, did it? I better go on to my next project. And again, I think that's something which is implicit in the nature of narratives, that they do come to an end, and bringing the narrative to a close then creates a moment of disattachment from that narrative, and a point where you are no longer responsible. And that, again, I think is sort of interestingly problematic, particularly when you're trying to look at it from an eco-critical point of view, which was increasingly what we were trying to do, and increasingly one of the things I find very, very difficult. But anyway, so that's the basic thing that we outlined as far as the narrative of the film was concerned. I looked at it and I thought, okay, so there are a number of different possibilities here. So we could look at 4 or more stories just out of that synopsis. But also, I'll leap on after that, we thought, okay, if the feature film doesn't happen, then what have we got? So there could be other options for going on with this project in different ways. So it could either be that sort of feature film adaptation and that treatment, or it could be cheaper to do a kind of found footage feature film, whereby Garth's impounded film is secreted in a vault somewhere in the Ministry of Control and sort of comes back years later, and people look at it and think, what the hell is this? So it's a film as seen by an audience many years later. In that respect, it does have quite interesting parallels with a tremendously interesting novel, I think of about 1994, by Robin Llewellyn, called Seren Wen ar Gefndir Gwyn, a white star on a white background, which has the same sort of found footage quality about it. So we also thought about the possibility of doing something which is a little bit more multimedia based. So either we could have a kind of feature film in a theatrical location. We could make what we jokingly called Cafflogville. So it would be a sort of Dogville type version of Cafflogion, which is the drama as portrayed in a theatre studio. Or we could do a sort of Godardian Alphaville type mashup of a specific kind of forest location, but then populated by people who are quite obviously actors. So that was another possibility. Then there was a sort of multimedia theatre performance. And finally, and I just wanted to sort of speculate about this to finish with, is sort of the making of documentary. And what that would be would not really be the story. I'll zip along here so I can get to some details about this. Not really the story of the novel itself, but there's basically a story about Dafydd, and a story about Dafydd making a film about, or trying to make some kind of creative adaptation of his father's novel. And also thinking about how the materials available to us were just, it wasn't just this that was our material. Our materials were us, our materials were memories, our materials were knowledge about particular places in Wales. And in that respect, I also sort of thought about, the way in which we could just sift through this sort of vast range of just remnants or propositions about a particular project and a particular kind of action. And in order to do that, I'm drawing, of course, from Mike Pearson's work in theatre archaeology. Hello, Mike. Anyway, so that was going to be basically the story about Geralt, Jones and Dafydd, and how Dafydd felt a particular kind of relationship to the material, and also a particular sort of responsibility to the material. And I think in some ways that is as dramatically interesting as anything within the novel itself. And of course, it would have been deeply insincere of me to sort of stand back and say, I can do that as a director without thinking about my own experience of the relationship between myself and my own father. So this broader sweep of concerns was also something that came up when we were thinking about the process of adapting this work. And now, of course, we can go on with it, and it might be the subject of a grant application before very long. And the substance of that is basically going to be, how do you work creatively together when you're, 14,000 miles apart? What can you do? What can you not do? How can you turn the things that you can do and things that you can't do into creative aspects of this particular project and to creative strengths? Now, at the time, 2019, I thought the possibility of doing that, of course, was extremely interesting and a bit out there. And I wondered if the technology was available to allow us to do it. And here we are in 2020, doing just about everything according to this particular kind of technology. So that's it. And I realize I have gone on far, far too long here because I've got a little bit of interview with David, which I wanted to play, but I'm not sure that we want to make the time for that or whether I've gone on long enough already. How are we doing?
Well, Rog, shall I suggest that maybe we open it up?
Yes.
Discussions, and then we'll see how things go. And maybe some you want to return to from the interview.
Yes. Okay. No, that's fine.
Something that occurred to me just to start the ball rolling, and then I thought we'll open it to the floor for about 15-20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that in the last 50 years, there's been quite a tradition of dystopian novels in Welsh settings. I'm thinking of Ydydd Olaf by Owain Owain in 1976, which was just preceded Cafflogion. Then you could include even a version of alternative history like Owen Shears's Resistance. But then I think if we come through to the Welsh language work of Lloyd Jones's Adur in 2014, and then again in terms of recent Welsh fiction that's been very acclaimed, Ivan Morgan-Jones's Babel in 2020, which was awarded the Welsh Language Fiction Book of the Year, and also Iaith Nefoedd by Lloyd Owen recently. Do you think there's any? Well, I'm asking you, how would you contest